A life is turned into a brand, and a brand is turned into revenue. That monopoly is convenient for a corporation. It is unwieldy for a state that wants options. Temp V appears as the fix, 24 hours, then back to normal. A syringe instead of a lifetime. That detail is not just packaging. It solves the political problem of permanent allegiance. It also answers a procurement headache: how to field capabilities quickly without living with them forever. The design promise is control, time-boxed risk, and deniability. If something goes wrong, it was a temporary measure. If it goes right, it was a precision tool. We should be clear on the baseline it was replacing. Compound V made supes by administering a blue serum to infants, then managing the fallout for decades. When that secret began to crack open, the corporate message was blunt. Executives stressed crisis and distance. Edgar framed it with lines like, "America needs its heroes more than ever," while insisting on internal investigations and ignorance of wrongdoing. The point was not truth. It was narrative containment. In practice, this kept the supply of power narrow, expensive, and gate-kept. Temp widened the funnel without opening the gates. You did not need to be chosen at birth. You needed access to a vial. For Vought, that was the true innovation. It turns power into a consumable sold into agencies, militaries, and inevitably the gray market. It looks like democratization. It is metered dependence. A new kind of billable hour appears, heroism as a day rate. The official pitch carried the language of modern procurement. Equip elite teams for superhuman threats. Offer parity without creating new celebrities. Keep the chain of command intact because users revert to ordinary personnel after the mission. It promised legal insulation, too. If there is misconduct, the company can argue it was a contracted capability, not a rogue supe with years of cover-ups behind them. What mattered here was risk reframed as logistics. That pitch landed because the environment had already been primed by fear. After the Compound V leak, the super-terrorist frame did double duty. It justified more spending and made corporate partnership feel like patriotism. The strategy fits a familiar media pattern. When legitimacy is shaky, institutions re-inject reality with crises and moral urgency. Baudrillard described this impulse as power manufacturing gravity in a world of simulation. Vought used the gravity of threat to sell control that looked like restraint. From a pure design lens, Temp V also looked elegant. Time-limited exposure reduces the window for acute carnage. Supervisors can plan around a clock. Pharmacologically, a fast onset profile with a predictable decay curve supports mission planning. In theory, a cap on duration imposes a cap on harm. The important point is not just what it does in the body, but how a timer changes behavior above it. Behavior bends around timers. If a squad knows they have 24 hours of invulnerability, they pull risk forward. Negotiation time shrinks. Breach plans get bolder. Users also feel effects: physiological arousal, new senses, raw force. That reward aggression. This is classic risk compensation. Seatbelts make drivers feel safer. Some then drive faster. Temp V makes operators feel invulnerable. Some then push beyond doctrine. The bill often arrives after the clock runs out. The harm is not only tactical. Temp V's real trap sits in delayed costs. We learn that repeated doses are neurotoxic. Brain lesions appear after a handful of injections. At first, this factor stays off stage. In part, that is marketing. A product is rarely introduced with its long-tail morbidity. In part, it is also the logic of triage. Agencies tell themselves they will use it sparingly, and then a crisis arrives that seems to demand one more vial. The short term always speaks louder. The institution-level effects build quietly. Once a capability exists, plans change to assume it. Training hours shift toward integrating a superhuman battering ram. Budgets migrate to procurement lines. Psychological safety within teams warps. The person expected to shoot up becomes the hinge pin. Commanders begin to imagine operations as two-stage affairs: ordinary work, then a button for miracles. In other words, the option becomes a habit. There is an analogy here to how capital fuses with the state in times of uncertainty. Political theorists use Bonapartist as a shorthand for a system where executive power floats above classes by balancing them, often leaning on bureaucracy and force. Vought sits in that space. It sells the capacity for force while shaping the rules around it. Temp V strengthens that position. The company can equip a government arm today and take the vial away tomorrow. Control is asserted not by owning people, but by owning options. Marketing finishes the job, not in late-night ads, but in a subtler culture of consultancy. The Cool Hunter era taught brands to mine subcultures, package them, and feed clients confident, edgy narratives. Vought's PR arsenal has lived here for years. A technology is framed as inevitable, nimble, and modern. Viral communications carry the message that borrowed power is smart governance, not corporate creep. That narrative gives cover to officials who like solutions that arrive in a case instead of a committee. If Temp V was so controllable, why did outcomes worsen? This is the open loop we will track. One answer is visible now. The time limit privatizes upside and socializes downside. Vought sells a powerful window. Agencies collect the short-term wins. The costs, neurological damage, escalation and dependency, surface later, and often outside the event horizon of the decision-maker who signed the contract. By the time the pattern is visible, institutional memory has already conformed to the shortcut. Consider how public messaging blurred cause and effect. When the Compound V secret began to unravel, executives stressed that rogue actors had exploited the system. "We are conducting a robust investigation," they said, disavowing knowledge. That script did more than deflect blame. It taught observers to expect product-based solutions to crisis. In that climate, Temp V is introduced as a rational update. A scandal about permanent power flow yields a proposal for temporary control. The contradiction is presented as continuity. The operational promise also created moral comfort. Teams could tell themselves they were not joining the soup economy. They were borrowing it for the right reasons. That line is potent. That it closes the distance between the fear of supes and the desire to beat them with the same tools. It also distorts accountability. A permanent soup is a walking, named risk. A temporary one is a file note in a mission log. The important point is how that change hides the human cost under procedure. We need to acknowledge the human incentives under the policy. Temp V makes ordinary operatives feel, for a few hours, like they can level horrifying odds. For some, that feels like justice, or at least closure. For others, it is a career accelerant. Success under the influence looks like brilliance. The drug's effects amplify self-belief exactly when caution is most needed. This helps explain why a design built for restraint becomes a platform for excess. On the corporate side, product cadence matters. After a leak and public outrage, selling a modified version performs contrition without surrender. It says, "We heard you. We made it safer." That detail tells us something important about reputation management. When the core is rotten, a company often introduces governance by feature: railings after a fall, stickers after a recall, temporary power after permanent power scandal. The move buys time and reaffirms the seller as the problem solver. Legally and politically, Temp V also creates deniability. Contracts specify duration, authorized users, and mission types. Compliance departments can assert that misuse was outside spec. Lawmakers can say they approved a tool, not a new class of citizens with dangerous rights. The frame is capability, not personhood. That shift lowers resistance within bureaucracies that worry about long-term costs. They convince themselves they are managing tech, not creating politics. Notice how this feeds a broader escalation spiral. Once temporary power exists, Adversaries expect it. Criminals pursue their own sources. The black market prices authorities caution into cheaper, dirtier copies. Each side points to the other as the reason to escalate. Institutions then call for more doses to maintain parity. The safer option multiplies the encounters where superhuman force appears, raising the background risk for everyone else. We have already seen how public fear was instrumentalized to justify this path. In speeches after attacks, executives paired condolences with a reminder. Threats could be worse, and only heroic capacity stood in the way. America needs its heroes more than ever, one insisted. That cadence works because it fuses grief with purchase. It narrows the policy debate to a choice between paralysis and procurement. Temp V rides that logic to legitimacy. All of this makes Temp V sound like a trap by design, and in many ways it is. But the subtler point is that the trap works because it feels like prudence. Time-limited power checks so many boxes, budgetary, legal, operational, that its long-term dysfunction arrives disguised as good management. In practice, the tool changes the user. Budgets shift, training shifts, leadership expectations shift. What began as an exception becomes a premise. We will unpack the biology later, but one feature belongs in the foundation. The brain lesions reported after several injections are not an accidental footnote. They reveal something about how the product's incentives were structured. A drug that exacts its price slowly clears the runway for repeat use in the short term. Decision-makers see no immediate cliff. By the time costs surface, the calendar has rolled over, and the responsibility is diffused. That design logic is as structural as any molecule. This is where the fusion of corporation and state shows its teeth. When capital can sell force, and the state can buy legitimacy through contracted strength, both sides benefit from tools that defer harm. It is a modern Bonapartist bargain in miniature. The executive center, corporate or governmental, stands above the mess, balancing interests. While the ledger gains numbers now and loses people later, the balance only holds until dependency hollows the system. So the offer stands. A day of power, and you will not have to live with it tomorrow. The cost you do not see is that tomorrow becomes shaped by the expectation of that day. Every mission after is planned with a phantom dose in mind. Every user after carries some of the last user's damage in their odds. And every institution after recenters around the hope that the shortcut will be there when needed. We begin here because this is how engineered control slips into engineered dependence. Temp V was sold as a fix for the chaos of Compound V. It worked because it was legible to managers and survivable at first for users. The next steps in this story trace how that legibility granted it access everywhere, and how the costs, once deferred, came back with interest. The loan always comes due. The question is who pays and how much the system has already promised to spend before anyone reads the bill. Temp V began as an engineering problem framed like a calendar invite. How do you switch on superhuman capabilities quickly, hold them for just long enough to finish a task, and then switch them off on schedule? That framing tells us why the product looks tidy. Timing is predictable, dosage is prepackaged, and the aftermath is, at least on paper, easy to file away. In practice, that neatness is the point. If power can be turned into a time box, administrators can finally plan around it. The delivery choice followed that logic. An injectable shot is fast, verifiable, and countable. A syringe can be logged, signed out, and signed back in, without creating a person who will need a lifetime of oversight. That detail reveals the heart of the design. Keep the capability measurable, so it can pass through procurement, legal review, and public relations without leaving a permanent trail. A dose becomes a transaction, not a birth. Unitization did more than simplify logistics. It let commanders translate power into budgets and time codes. One vial for one op meant one line item. That helps explain why Temp V moved smoothly through bureaucratic gates that permanent compound V never could. A child dose for life creates sunk costs, moral outrage, and an open-ended liability. A grown adult dosed for a day creates a spreadsheet entry and a consent form. The activation window solved a second, subtler problem. With permanent compound V, powers emerge during development, and the result varies wildly. That randomness made supes both risky and, for Vought, irreplaceably marketable. By contrast, Temp V promised a tighter envelope. Onset within a short window, duration near a single day, and an endpoint you could plan to the hour. The important point is not that it fixed unpredictability, but that it concentrated it into a slice of time you could schedule and ensure. Even the pharmacology, as framed by Vought's own materials, supported that promise of control. A short-lived carrier, a volatile activation pathway, and a design metabolic crash were presented as features, not bugs. This helps explain why the pitch emphasized reversibility. The system turns on fast because the compounds flood the relevant receptors. It turns off because the carrier burns out, leaving the body to clear the rest. That clock was the selling point. The design also tried to shave down cross-user variability at the margins. Compared with injecting infants and watching their biology rewrite itself over years, adult dosing with a time-capped agent is, by definition, more bounded. What mattered here was the appearance of manageability. You might not know which exact power will express, but you could know when it would start and stop. That semblance of consistency reads like safety to a risk committee. On the ground, those choices changed how missions were planned. A team could map two entry windows, one for the drug to hit, another for the user to stand down before the crash. That allowed layered contingency plans and after-action deniability. If something went wrong hours later, the commander could say, honestly or not, that the enhancement window had already closed. The timestamp became part of the legal shield, yet variability still lived inside the window. Power expression remained unpredictable across users, and even across doses. That mattered during real operations. A teleporting operative might emerge without gear, because the power did not transport clothing. A beam emitter might spill collateral energy in close quarters. Each outcome solved one tactical problem while creating new ones. The window made logistics easier. It did not make physics kinder. Marketing smoothed those edges. Vought framed Temp V as a responsible tool. No permanent supes, fewer public relations headaches, and a switch you could flip off. This pitch answered criticisms that exploded when Compound V's secrets leaked. Parents signing children's lives away, communities built on a lie, and executives feigning ignorance. By saying temporary, Vought tried to redirect the moral conversation from creation to consent. We know from the record that deception had been foundational. When Starlight confronted her mother about childhood injections, the rationale was couched in euphemism and necessity. That history helps explain the power of Temp V's messaging. If the outrage against lifelong V was about stolen childhoods and permanent consequences, a single-use adult dose felt ethically cleaner. It allowed people to tell themselves they were borrowing, not becoming. Inside large institutions, that framing unlocked budgets. A temporary enhancement slotted into expense reports like overtime or equipment rental. Compliance officers could check boxes because the exposure looked discreet and consent-driven. That detail reveals why adoption spread beyond elite units. The product felt like a tool a middle manager could justify without adding a long-term line of risk to the organization's balance sheet. But the core pharmacology carried a catch that packaging could not erase. Temp V fixed acute neurotoxicity that compounded with repeated use. The body could ride out one surge, but the second or third pushed vulnerable tissues past repair. Tests circulated by whistleblowers pointed to brain lesions after a handful of doses, with mortality spikes after repeat exposures. The curve was not linear, it bent upward sharply. That non-linear risk misled decision-makers. Early doses felt survivable, which encouraged reuse. The important point is that survivability in round 1 said little about rounds 3 and 4. Small intervals between missions increased cumulative stress, as the brain and vascular system had not recovered before the next storm hit. What looked controllable by the clock was not controllable by the tissue that had to absorb it. The engineering also hid where the damage happened. Because the activation signal was powerful and systemic, it involved intense metabolic demand. Cells ran hot. In that state, even tiny flaws in blood vessels or myelin could turn catastrophic. The crash at the end of the window was not just behavioral fatigue, it was a physiological reckoning. People described pounding headaches, vision changes, and memory gaps. Those were warning lights, not mere side effects. Institutionally, warnings are easy to file and hard to absorb. Commanders heard the lab cautions, then heard field reports of successful ops. And like many organizations under pressure, they believed the near-term wins. This helps explain why protocols often evolve to manage the crash, not to reduce total exposure. Aftercare kits were issued. Schedules built in recovery days. But the real hazard was cumulative, not immediate. Vought's public posture, when challenged, tracked a familiar playbook. In crises, institutions often speak in denial to preserve legitimacy. They simulate control to project safety. We saw that pattern around Compound V's origins, with executives insisting supes were born, not made, until evidence forced a pivot. Temp V repeated the gesture. The company touted internal reviews and responsible use guidelines, while distancing itself from unauthorized applications. The broader lesson has precedent. In the 20th century, technocratic tools were sold as neutral improvements to institutional performance, then used to enable aggressive strategies. The Chicago Boys offer a telling analogy. Programs funded to improve economic institutions helped rationalize policies that rode shotgun with coups. The instruments looked modern and responsible, but they traveled with power. That comparison matters because Temp V functioned the same way. It lowered the friction for harder choices. On a battlefield or a police perimeter, lower friction changes thresholds. If one syringe can tip a standoff, commanders start planning to have that syringe on hand. That reduces hesitation and increases the odds that each new situation is resolved by escalation. The timer that promises restraint also encourages reach. After a few wins, standing orders evolve. Bring 2, just in case. That is mission creep written in a delivery device. There was another quiet benefit marketed to leaders: after-action deniability. If the enhancement ended at 1400 hours, then anything ugly at 1600 could be attributed to ordinary human error. That separation let legal teams draw clean lines for liability. In other words, the window doubled as a jurisdiction. Inside it, extraordinary force. Outside it, routine and explanations. Operators felt the clock in their bones. A guaranteed peak made them push during the window, which raised risk tolerance. The psychology was predictable. When the most power you will ever have is measured in hours, you sprint. That sprint magnifies both decisive outcomes and catastrophic overshoots. And because results were spectacular, organizations overlearned from the good days and underweighted the silent damage that followed. Temp V's apparent controllability also simplified training and procurement. You did not need a bespoke ethics regime for lifelong supes. You needed a briefing, a lockbox, and a chain of custody. That helped police departments and intelligence units write quick policies. What mattered here was policy fit. A tool that fits existing paperwork routes always spreads faster than a tool that requires new doctrine. This helps explain the speed of adoption once the product was on offer. Even the color and branding of the formula mattered. A distinct hue and a clear label, V24, signal difference from the scandal-scarred Compound V. That visual separation was marketing as risk management. The product looked like a new start. By renaming and repackaging, Vought helped buyers tell themselves they were not repeating the same moral hazard. They were modernizing their toolkit. Still, variability in powers never fully receded. That variability mattered for team design. Pairing an unknown ability with breachers or medics required new playbooks. Planners wrote modular tactics to exploit whatever emerged. It made operations agile but brittle. When the ability skewed destructive, friendly configurations became liabilities. When it skewed evasive, rules of engagement bent under the strain. The crash, meanwhile, imposed a predictable vulnerability. After the window, users were depleted and cognitively dulled. That detail would shape the next decision. Teams now had to guard enhanced members during egress and recovery. That protection siphoned capacity from the main mission. In practice, planners often solved that by issuing more doses to offset risks created by the first. The fix fed the problem. Market signals reflected this spiral. Demand for Temp V rose not just with the number of missions, but with the complexity of plans that had been redesigned around the drug. That is dependency by architecture. Once an institution rewrites standard operating procedures to expect a timer-based advantage, the absence of that advantage feels like a deficit. Budgets then justify recurring purchases as maintaining readiness. Vought leaned into that perception. Training materials framed Temp V as a bridge capability until appropriate permanent assets could be assigned. The language sounded prudent, yet it positioned every delay as a reason to dose again. The important point is that a bridge can become a highway when the detour is profitable. By calling it temporary, the company made repetition look like responsibility rather than appetite. Public relations filled the gaps between science and practice. Speeches and staged mission, accomplished moments positioned, enhanced human teams as the real heroes, subtly sidelining the question of why a temporary drug was necessary at all. That narrative deflected scrutiny from the supplier to the user. It also suggested that the system was working as designed, even when the design was eroding the users it relied on. Inside the lab, researchers tracked alarming trends. Animal models showed signs consistent with excitotoxic damage after repeated spikes in power output. Human scans, when leaked, showed lesions that aligned with those findings. The crash's headaches and nausea were not benign. They were early-stage alarms, yet the window design created a blind spot. Because the worst injuries manifested outside operational hours, institutions mislabeled them as private health issues. There is a deeper reason why temporary enhancements trick institutions. Time-limited tools look like they minimize commitment, which feels like minimizing risk. But risk does not only live in duration, it lives in intensity and repetition. Temp V compressed a lifetime of strain into bursts. That compression concentrated harm in ways that long-term oversight would have detected. Without that oversight, the harm hid in plain sight. Consider how oversight agencies respond to discrete events. They investigate incidents with clear beginnings and endings. A drug that promises an end by design plays to that bias. If the damage shows up months later in cognitive drift or impulse control, it will not read as a Temp V casualty in a spreadsheet. That mismatch allows continued use even as the casualty pool grows. This is the same institutional illusion that allows sanitized tools to legitimize harder strategies. When a policy can claim clean instrumentation, harder edges become thinkable. In Chile, an economics program dressed as modernization traveled alongside bayonets. It worked because it looked like math, not force. Here, Temp V looked like scheduling, not transformation. That image enabled risk-hungry tactics under a veneer of process control. Foreshadowing was baked into the product's safety features. The more confidently you can plan the window, the more often you will plan to use it. The easier the dose is to count, the easier it is to count again. Features that sell as guardrails become on-ramps. A clean stopwatch, a neat vial, a reassuring briefing. Each reduces friction. Lower friction means higher frequency. Frequency turns into damage. There was also a market outside formal channels. Any tool that compresses power into a vial invites gray markets. The very traits that impress procurement officers, portability, unitization, and a predictable window, also made theft and diversion simple. Even here the engineering played a role. Because the crash came fast and the evidence cleared quickly, unauthorized users could dodge detection. That too is how safety becomes spread. It is worth noting how this differs from permanent compound V in public perception. When The Secret of Lifelong Dosing came out, anger focused on origins and identity. With Temp V, origins were paperwork, not parenthood. That shift matters. It muted outrage even as it expanded use. The story became one of tools and policies, not of people made into products. The moral center of gravity moved away from the supplier. For all that, the short-term functionality was real. Teams met objectives they could not have met. That reality explains adoption better than cynicism alone. It worked, and in complex systems, it works is an argument that drowns out warnings until the bill arrives. The problem was not that the clock lied. The problem was that the clock was only measuring one kind of cost. By now, a pattern should be visible. Engineering choices that created uptake, the shot, the window, the unitized dose, also shaped the path of harm. They made the tool legible to institutions built on schedules and consent forms. They encouraged repetition by design. And they hid the slow-motion damage in the quiet hours after the op. The drug was built to look safe because visibility is what moves products into systems. From a distance, that looks like clever product management. But systems adapt around whatever they can count. When the countable thing is temporary power, the adaptation rewards speed over recovery, frequency over reflection, and deniability over accountability. That is the mechanism under the marketing. It did not just change what individuals could do for a day. It changed what institutions felt authorized to attempt, again and again, because the stopwatch said it would end soon. The strange part is how familiar this is once you strip away the superhero gloss. Organizations love tools that collapse time, centralize control, and reduce visible liabilities. They love them even more when those tools deliver striking results in the first few trials. Temp V hit that sweet spot, and by doing so, it turned the safety story into a growth story. The rest of the arc follows from that one choice. Design power as a schedule. The first thing the timer does is change how people think about risk. A countdown turns power into a window you can schedule, not a trait you must live with. That matters because planning shifts from avoiding danger to exploiting a temporary edge. Once a team can turn on super-tier capability for a slice of time, the safest plan starts looking like the boldest plan. Operational calculus flips in small, practical ways. Entry teams pick doors they would never choose unpowered, because a teammate can punch through steel for exactly 15 minutes. Surveillance units plan shorter tails, assuming a powered sprint will close the gap later. This helps explain why early encounters feel almost rehearsed. The drug lets them script a brief period when physics bends. Inside that window, failure feels reversible. A normal operation treats mistakes as compounding risk you try to bleed off. A Temp V plan assumes errors can be bulldozed during the active phase. That detail reveals how the drug compresses deliberation. People stop carrying contingencies because brute force looks like a universal backup. The psychology is familiar from behavioral economics. Present bias pushes users to value certainty now over health later. A guaranteed shove through a wall today crowds out an invisible lesion tomorrow. In practice, that trade barely feels like a decision because the timer makes the present unusually vivid. The threat is right there. The headache is later. There is also the certainty effect. A 100% chance of power for 1 hour beats a fuzzy promise of safety over months. That helps explain why policies written in conference rooms often crumble at the door. When a watch reads 9 minutes left and the objective is 30 meters away, nobody argues about tomorrow's scan. On the ground, the rush changes who gets to decide. The person holding the capacity to ignore bullets suddenly drives the tempo. Command structures say they are in charge, but in practice, tempo is power. Teams start to orbit the enhanced teammate, waiting for cues. That shift does not announce itself. It happens because follow-through looks easier behind a walking shield. Consider the early uses by Billy Butcher. When he first doses, he gains the kind of invulnerability and energy projection that make questioning a hostile asset a different proposition. He corners gunpowder and forces information through a mix of intimidation and pure resilience. The important point is not the spectacle, but the decision it allows. An unpowered investigator cannot sit 10 feet from a trained marksman and keep pressing. On Temp V, he can. Those wins feel clean because they appear to target only the problem. You need access. You punch in. You need compliance. You stare down the muzzle and don't blink. That narrowness creates an illusion of control, and the timer deepens it. When a risk is bound to a watch, the brain treats it as contained. The mind quietly whispers, "Just this once, inside this box." Yui's first teleport is the purer version of the rush. He spots a teammate about to be overrun in a foreign lab, injects, and vanishes. He reappears behind an armed guard, lands an impossible punch, and breaks the line of attack. That action is striking, but the underlying change is more important. Teleportation trims the delay between decision and outcome to almost nothing. When time to effect collapses, deliberation does too. The next mission is planned around that memory, not the policy. Leaders reach for what worked, even if they never write it down. This is path dependence, built one urgent moment at a time. That helps explain why a team's standard operating procedures can tilt toward power without a formal decision. After a few rescues like that, the unpowered route feels like negligence. The timer has another quiet effect. It de-emphasizes the cost of repetition. A clear boundary suggests a reset once it expires. Users learn to ask for just one more window, because each window looks like a discrete choice. This is the bounded fallacy of the stopwatch. A limit that appears to contain risk often raises frequency, and total exposure rises faster than anyone expects. Caution gets marginalized, not because it is wrong, but because it lacks receipts. After-action reviews tend to credit visible actions. The person who broke a wall is easier to praise than the person who argued for a safer angle 10 minutes earlier. Over time, this shifts incentives toward the decisive user and away from the skeptical planner. Teams do not announce this shift. They drift into it. In command rooms, Temp V solves a scheduling problem. Intelligence targets are often perishable. A smuggler's rendezvous, a courier's handoff, a motorcade with a sensitive passenger. Everyone creates a tiny window of vulnerability. A drug that creates symmetrical windows on the user side will be irresistible. You can line the two up and call that efficiency. Black Ops doctrine likes anything that reduces footprints and increases deniability. A temporary enhancement leaves no long-term asset to explain. There is no payroll line for a permanent supe, no public safety dossier to maintain. The operative returns to baseline, and the paper trail says nothing durable happened. That feature aligns too well with covert incentives to be ignored. This is why intelligence services and private security firms are early adopters. Short activation windows mirror how clandestine work actually gets done. A team can be ordinary on entry, extraordinary on contact, and ordinary again on exit. If something goes wrong, the institution can truthfully say, there were no supers on the roster. The drug launders not just power, but accountability. The dynamic resembles something outside this universe. controlled elections under occupation. In the 2005 Iraqi elections, as the Financial Times noted, votes were held under pressure from Grand Ayatollah Ali Sistani, and the US-backed Iyad Alawi drew roughly 12%. Shiite and Kurdish lists won majorities, yet key levers, budgets, oil revenues, administration, media, remained controlled by the occupying authority. The important point is not the numbers, but the architecture. You can allow choice while designing the frame so outcomes stay aligned to the controller's interests. Temp V creates a similar frame at the tactical level. Operators can choose when to inject and how to use the window, but the supplier sets the ceiling, the side effects, and the scarcity. Those constraints steer behavior toward the most aggressive use within the window, because that is when the drug pays off. In other words, bounded choice still channels decisions toward the designer's intent. The anchoring effect of early success cannot be overstated. When Butcher and Hughie later stand with Soldier Boy and briefly pin Homelander in close combat, it confirms a lesson that will shape everything after. For a few breathless minutes, the impossible looks like a manageable engineering problem. Align a legacy weapon, stack 2 Temp V windows, and strike while the timer holds. That visual proof is powerful because it simplifies the problem. It tells the brain, this is doable, just compress variables harder. Once teams internalize that, they retool. Training days drift toward integrating powered bursts. Briefs start including activation windows alongside comms checks and exfil routes. Risk matrices implicitly assume invulnerability will be on hand for the first push, and maybe the second. That process is invisible to the public, but transformative inside units. Policies do not change, assumptions do. Non-users adapt as well, and not always by choice. A medic stops planning for a protracted bleed-out because teammates will be invulnerable during contact. A tech lead scripts hacks for 30 seconds of line of sight, trusting a teammate to hold a door no human should hold. This works as long as the watch cooperates. It also means that when the watch doesn't, failures cascade. The human cost starts as a change in self-concept. Hughie, long framed as the careful one, finds a new story about himself. He is someone who can act first and win. That shift carries its own reward loop. It is not just adrenaline. It is identity relief. Temp V is not only a performance boost. It is a personality shortcut, which is why stopping is harder than it looks from the outside. There is also risk compensation. When seat belts became standard, drivers in some studies took corners faster. Here, a powered skin becomes a social seatbelt. A teammate on Temp V takes risks he would have previously vetoed, and others mirror him. The team is not reckless by character. They are rational under a new assumption. The safe speed moved. Institutionally, this produces brittle success. Operations clear faster, objectives stack, and metrics look good. That is seductive in bureaucracies that survive on quarterly performance and public relations. A clip of a powered rescue at a facility fire, say, a rehearsal gone wrong in a corporate arena, will play better than an uneventful night. The highlight is a story asset, and the drug becomes a content engine. Public messaging again works like the occupation analogy. Control of the media environment lets the controller define what counted as progress. Vought's public relations bench has long redirected attention from origins to outcomes. Remember the early moment when Starlight learns that powers came from Compound V, not birth. Not. The shock is real, but the corporate line remains. Mission accomplished. Heroes on the scene. That pattern preps the audience to accept bursts of borrowed power without asking who lent it. Inside agencies, after-action paperwork reinforces the cycle. Commendations flow to decisive actions and life-saving force. Side effects are deferred to medical files, which are privacy protected and hard to aggregate. The accounting system is structured to see the wins and scatter the losses. This helps explain why dependency can grow even as health warnings mount. The institution does not feel the damage as one number. Black markets track institutional desire. Wherever official demand is high and scrutiny inconvenient, unofficial channels appear. A time-limited drug with fast onset and short duration fits the rhythm of illicit work. It can be paid for per job, administered off-site, and denied if the aftermath becomes messy. That structure multiplies systemic risk because it arms actors outside any rules. The timer worsens that problem by signaling low commitment. Buyers frame it as leasing, not owning, the dangerous thing. That framing lowers moral and legal thresholds. If a tool feels like a brief rental, the user is more likely to test it. This is the illusion of containment at scale. Bounded power looks safe enough to try. So more people try it. Team dynamics, meanwhile, sort people by willingness to dose. Those who refuse become the slow variable in systems designed for fast variables. Even when leaders promise parity, operational gravity pulls in one direction. As one veteran says with a shrug, we planned for the fastest person. The effect is marginalization by tempo. There is a final twist in the short-term wins. Each successful use trains the user to ignore early side effects. A headache after victory feels like earned fatigue. A blackout at home, hours later, is a private problem. This is how the health bill stays invisible long enough for habits to form. A discount applied 10 times becomes culture. From the outside, it can seem puzzling that people keep dosing once the warning labels get louder. In practice, careers are built on the early streak. Promotions, trust, and access concentrate around the operators who delivered when the watch was running. Quitting looks like stepping out of your own proof of value. That social trap is as strong as any chemical pull. The short-term wins also migrate upward. Budgets grow around the expectation of powered windows. Gear is selected to complement bursts of force. Vehicles, comms, and even breaching tools are bought under the assumption that humans will, briefly, be far more than human. Resilience planning quietly thins out. Why build redundancy when you plan to punch straight through? All of this makes the early adoption look rational and the later unraveling feel surprising. But the seeds of the fall are planted at the start. The same timer that makes power seem safe narrows options. The same visibility that earns praise blinds decision-makers to costs. The same identity relief detaches users from older guardrails. What began as an elegant patch starts to rewrite the code beneath it. The comparative lens helps keep the picture honest. In a controlled election, you can point to enthusiastic participation and legitimate tallies. You can insist the public got what it voted for. But if budgets, oil revenues, and media remain with the occupier, power did not truly shift. With Temp V, you can point to responsible dosing, careful timings, and admirable rescues. Yet the supply, the side effects, and the narrative remain with the maker. Agency exists, but it is pre-shaped. That pre-shaping is why the rush is not easily unwound. Even when individuals decide to stop, the institutions that retooled around the window cannot simply reverse their playbooks. They will search for substitutes or look the other way as gray channels fill the gap. This is how shortcuts become dependencies. They burrow into routines until a return to baseline feels like retreat. We have focused on why the early phase works. Wait. The next consequence is what happens when the watch hits zero and the bill comes due. Not just in bodies, but in trust and structure. The timer that gave clarity also creates cliff edges, and people live at the edge once they learn to count down. That detail will shape everything that follows. The bill for Temp V does not arrive as a single invoice. It shows up as small losses that are easy to explain away, until they are not. The timer hides the cost because it makes damage look like a short event, rather than an accumulating process. Physiologically, the short event is anything but simple. Temp forces a body to do days of work in a few minutes using brain and organ systems, as if they were overclocked machines. That framing helps explain why the early price looks like headaches, nosebleeds, and tremors, and why the late price looks like something breaking all at once. The acute harm sits in the brain. Users show neurotoxic stress not as a smooth line, but as step changes, like a staircase you do not notice until you miss a step. That non-linear pattern is what makes the fifth dose exponentially worse than the first. Inside the window, neurotransmitters surge to keep perception fast and muscles primed. The same chemical that keeps reaction time sharp also tightens blood vessels and cranks blood pressure into dangerous ranges. That mix turns tiny brain vessels into weak points that can give way under stress. Clinicians describe it as microhemorrhage risk amplified by a pressurized state. In practice, that means capillaries in vulnerable regions begin to leak, then repair, then leak again. The repair is not perfect, so tiny scars stack up, quietly raising the chance that the next dose trips a much larger failure. Someone using Temp V for the fourth time may seem fine at rest, then black out when a loud noise spikes their pulse. That detail reveals how damage is stored as fragile equilibrium, not visible injury. The fifth injection knocks the system across a threshold, where hidden injuries suddenly act like a single catastrophe. Organ stress follows the same logic. The liver must metabolize a flood of synthetic compounds and inflammatory byproducts under heat and strain. The kidneys try to clear them while blood supply is rerouted to powered muscles, and that mismatch creates the conditions for longer-term organ wear. Cardiac risk climbs for similar reasons. Arrhythmias appear because the threshold for electrical misfire drops when you flood a heart with stimulatory signals. That helps explain why healthy people on Temp V can still experience dangerous rhythms once the fight or flight response has been kept on too long. The timer seduces planners because it ends, but the body's response does not reset with the watch. Vessels remain inflamed, neurons remain stressed, and immune systems remain on alert for hours or days, which is why stacking daily doses multiplies harm faster than common sense would suggest. This is the math behind the one more for this mission habit. Each decision looks like a small, controlled risk. The non-linear curve means they are really gambling with a risk that doubles while still feeling like it barely moved. The cognitive bill shows up first as sharpness. Users often report a compelling sense that everything is clearer and more urgent. That feeling is both real and misleading, because the same neurochemistry that makes motion feel decisive also narrows the frame of what is considered. In psychology, it is called attentional narrowing under arousal. In the field, it becomes tunnel vision with superhuman force behind it. Small misreads, which are usually survivable, turn lethal when delivered at twice the speed and 10 times the strength. A teammate steps into a doorway at a bad angle. The powered agent sees a silhouette and a metallic glint, and the brain, primed for threat, fills in a weapon. The next action is faster than language, and that speed is exactly what makes the misread so hard to call back. Aggression spikes for a related reason. When reward and threat circuits are both lit, taking action feels safer than waiting. That bias existed long before Temp V, but the drug packs more energy into the same bias, so restraint requires more deliberate effort than most users expect to find in the moment. This helps explain a pattern that appears in after-action files. Early doses accompany clean wins and confident debriefs. Later doses correlate with messy scenes, contradictory witness accounts, and commanders looking for language that frames collateral harm as unavoidable in tense conditions. It is not classic addiction. Users do not crave Temp V in the way someone craves a substance they need to feel normal. Instead, they learn that plans run smoother when someone on the team can cut a knot in 20 seconds, so the mission itself starts to depend on that ability. This is what we mean by mission-conditioned reliance. The capacity becomes part of the plan rather than a contingency. Once that happens, the fallback options atrophy because no one trains them as hard, and the unit gets locked into a path that only works when the dose arrives on time. You can hear it in the planning language. Instead of if we have Temp V, it turns into when the window opens. The shift seems minor, yet it builds an assumption into timing, routes, and risk models. That is how a tool begins to shape the job, not just assist it. The longer this goes on, the more the user becomes the plan. People who did not take Temp V still orbit around the one who did, adjusting their roles to support that timed burst. That detail reveals how identity can fuse with a capability, making it harder to walk away even when the costs become obvious. Case files show visible deterioration that units try to downplay. Recurrent nosebleeds get logged as dehydration. Migraines get called post-event headaches. Subtle hand tremors become stress, until a scan finally forces a new label: scattered lesions in white matter, consistent with cumulative vascular insult. Medical advisories do exist. Internal memos flag rising neurologic risks after repeated use, and some even warn about thresholds around the 4th or 5th dose. But advisories operate in the shadow of operations, and what matters there is the next deadline. Operational pressure turns every warning label into background noise. A commander under orders needs a tool that works today, not a perfect safety profile. That helps explain why advisories are read, initialed, and then quietly set aside behind the language of necessity. Denial at the unit level is shaped by the story they tell about themselves. Early victories made the users look like the only adults in a failing system. Hero-making narratives grow from those wins, and once a person is framed as the one who does what others cannot, signals of harm threaten more than health. They threaten meaning. Sunk cost bias deepens the denial. If a unit has trained, budgeted, and redeployed around Temp V, then admitting danger is also admitting that the last year of choices needs to be rethought. The human mind resists that move, which is why data can be clear while behavior remains stuck. Black budget units make the problem worse by design. They can classify adverse events, scatter medical reports under contractor non-disclosure agreements, and segment accountability so that no single overseer sees the full pattern. This prevents scandal in the short term, but delays the correction that could prevent the next collapse. There is a lesson here from outside the universe of power. In the late 1990s, companies embraced temporary labor to sidestep rules, cut costs, and keep options open. That move looked flexible on paper, but it also built dependence on a just-in-time workforce that hid risks until they emerged all at once. This analogy matters because Temp V is essentially the temp agency of violence. It lets institutions rent capability without hiring it, and in so doing, it lets them skirt the slower obligations that come with building resilient capacity. The appearance of flexibility gradually reduces real choices, just as European companies used long-term temp contracts to sidestep labor protections and found themselves structurally committed to churn. The market behaves accordingly. Once official channels carry a product that saves missions, gray channels appear to meet backlog demand. Counterfeit Temp V begins to circulate with poor quality control, inconsistent potency, and solvents that should never enter a vein. Those counterfeits raise every risk we have already described. Dosing varies by batch, so a normal shot may be a double. Impurities irritate vessels and organs, accelerating the very damage users hope to avoid by spacing out injections. The timer itself becomes unreliable on knockoffs. Some counterfeits do not decay on schedule, leaving users charged long after the plan ends. Others crash early, dropping a team into the most dangerous window, mid-move, with a plan built for power that is suddenly gone. Black markets also break the thin safety net of tracking. Official vials carry serials, chain of custody records, and embedded lot data. Street versions have nothing but word of mouth, which means adverse outcomes cannot be traced back to batch or maker, preventing even basic learning. In some regions, counterfeiters stretch supply by suspending active compound in low-grade carriers. That practice causes tissue damage at the injection site, clot risk in transit, and organ stress during breakdown. A problem that began as brain risk expands into a whole-body threat simply because the product is unregulated. For units under pressure, this should be a stop signal. In practice, it is a workaround signal. When procurement slows, people within the orbit of the plan find substitutes to keep schedules, which is how a gray market stopgap becomes a new normal. At the same time, the social cost grows inside teams. Non-users start to feel like liabilities when the tempo assumes superhuman anchors. They are pushed to the edges of the most meaningful action, and morale drifts because the work has been rewired or under capability. Some of them refuse to use. Relationships strain in small, telling ways. A teammate declines another round and is quietly removed from the roster that gets the best assignments. E. A supervisor sees a user trembling and green around the edges, but the mission clock is running, and the language becomes, "We need you. Just this once." That phrasing is not harmless. It uses loyalty to override caution, and it relies on the same story that built the dependence in the first place. If you are the person who does what others cannot, you cannot say no without threatening your standing. Denial turns to bargaining when the body's warnings get louder. Scans with clear lesions force new rules, like mandatory spacing between doses and maximum lifetime counts. But bargaining preserves the tool by drawing lines around the most visible danger, not by addressing how the system moved to rely on it. From the outside, it is easy to say the answer is to stop. Inside a restructured unit, stopping means rewriting playbooks, retraining teams, and losing the very metrics that won political support. That is why awareness often arrives too late to reverse course cleanly. This is where the web of rules metaphor earns its keep. On paper, elected officials run institutions. In practice, a tangle of procedures and dependencies limits what they can change without crisis. Temp V weaves a similar web around units, offering flexibility at first, then constricting usable options as everything reorganizes around it. Late recognition is a phase, not an event. You start to see internal clusters of adverse incidents that would have been rare before. An operation pauses when a user ceases mid-brief. A training accident suddenly looks like a symptom rather than a fluke. Medical files that were once scattered begin to align through whisper networks, and off-the-record briefings. A clinician who saw 3 cases compares notes with another who saw 4. Patterns emerge and the old labels, stress, dehydration, coincidence, no longer satisfy anyone paying attention. The institutional response splits. Some command chains lock down data harder, hoping to ride out a storm that has not fully formed. Others issue limited freezes, no more than 4 doses per operator, with exceptions requiring authorization, and then claim action has been taken. Freezes create their own workarounds. If a unit has 2 experienced users over the new cap, a 3rd operator gets pushed into the role with poor preparation. That transfer preserves the plan's tempo while increasing risk elsewhere. A familiar pattern when only symptoms get managed. Meanwhile, the market senses fear and tightens supply. Secondary sellers raise prices. Counterfeiters expand production. Users who worry about losing access quietly hoard vials, keeping boxes in lockers that become private stashes, disconnected from any official log. Hoarding changes behavior. People take doses near expiration, or mix partials from questionable batches to avoid waste. Those choices add variability to systems that require predictability, and variability is the enemy of safe planning. At some point, the first public incident lands. A user crashes on camera, or an internal leak surfaces scans that show unmistakable brain damage tied to repeat use. The revelation feels sudden to the outside world, But inside the units, it only confirms what many already suspected. Public pressure opens oversight windows, but the effect is uneven. Agencies promise reviews, and suppliers like Vought shift language toward warnings and personal responsibility. The important point is that the structure built around Temp V does not unwind with a press release. Legal teams move to frame the issue as misuse, not design. They point to advisories and signed waivers, shifting heat downstream. That posture mirrors how companies frame temp labor as choice and flexibility, even when the real effect is to offload risk and cut obligations. Users who try to stop face a harsh reality. Without the capability, they no longer match the job they were trained to do. That mismatch drives some back to the vial, despite knowledge of harm, a loop that looks like addiction from the outside and like survival inside. Families and partners see the change first. People come home exhausted in a new way, irritable, unable to concentrate, nursing headaches that do not pass. That detail tells us the bill is not only professional, it is relational, because the drug collapses margins that make ordinary life possible. Commanders who finally push to exit discover the final bind. The units they lead have been measured by Temp V-fueled victories, and the budgets that supported them reflect that timeline. Exiting means accepting a period of lower output while rebuilding slower, safer capacities. That rebuilding requires political cover that is rarely available in the wake of a scare. Leaders promise that the freeze is temporary, or that a safer version is in development. In other words, they buy time, which is the same logic that led them to the vial in the first place. The arc of denial, dependency, and delayed recognition is not unique to Temp V. It follows the curve of any shortcut that works well enough to rewrite habits before its costs are visible. The difference here is that the body keeps the ledger in tissue, and the corrections arrive through seizures, strokes, and lost lives. By the time awareness is thick enough to prompt serious change, the system has already internalized the shortcut. That makes exit costly and dangerous in the short term, even if it is healthier in the long term. The human and institutional impulse is to bridge with one more round, to get through this week, to wait for the new formulation. And that is how a product designed to limit risk multiplies it instead. The dose creates a clean window for emission, and then a dirty wake for everything else. What started as rented strength becomes a structure, and structures do not step aside easily. The bill has been itemized: physiology first, cognition next, then relationships and institutions. But we have not yet seen how the payment reshapes the broader map of power. That comes when oversight, markets, and rival actors adapt to the new reality of damage and denial set in motion by a timed vial. The next chapter presses on that pressure point, because once the damage is undeniable and the dependence is baked in, the contest shifts from whether Temp V is safe to who controls the clock, the supply, and the story. That is where structural change becomes visible to everyone, even those who never touched a syringe. When Temp V enters a room, the room rearranges itself around the clock. A power that used to sit with permanent superheroes now appears in bursts, in the hands of operatives and officials who used to wait outside. That detail matters because monopoly power works through scarcity, and a time-limited exception pierces scarcity without erasing it. The result is not open access to force, but scheduled access, which quietly centralizes control in whoever controls the schedule. Inside agencies, this is felt first as a planning change, and then as a leverage shift. If a team can book 24 hours of invulnerability for Thursday at noon, calendars become battle maps. Commanders who never had a supe on call now have a window, and windows invite gambles that ordinary capacity could not attempt. In practice, the organization keeps ordinary process on paper, but lets the clock overrule it. That reweighting would threaten Vought's long monopoly, but only if bursts could be separated from brands. The company's counter was to define authorized Temp V against everything else. By controlling labels, batch numbers, and a compliant script around dosing, Vought preserved reputational gravity even when product leaked. What mattered here was not merely supplying the drug, but supplying the narrative through which the drug could be used without career risk. Liability framing completed the move. Official channels came bundled with indemnity clauses, training modules, and advisory hotlines, so the use looked procedurally safe even when the biology was not. Off-label and black market doses were framed as reckless, which redirected blame onto end users if anything went wrong. This helps explain why risk-averse agencies still lined up. Buying the reputable version purchased deniability as much as capability. Hearings followed because optics always follow visible harm, yet the stagecraft looked familiar. Guidelines promised transparency while carving out trade secrets, national security exemptions, and ongoing pilot authorities that preserve supply. The public saw stern questions and solemn oaths. Inside, procurement officers got flowcharts showing how to keep buying. The important point is that regulation can soothe outrage while standardizing the very pipeline it claims to restrain. You can see the older pattern underneath it. In the mid-20th century, new rules briefly checked corporate reach. Then a convergence of technology, law, and ideology vaulted firms back to dominance. Here, Temp V plays the technology, hearings play the law, and fear of being outgunned supplies the ideology. The fusion produces a familiar outcome. Oversight that guarantees continuity of a product, not continuity of public safety. Call it a Bonapartist bargain if you like, a fusion of corporate and state capacity, where the bureaucracy fronts the authority and the corporation runs the instrument. It clarifies why oversight bodies end up protecting supply more than people. If the instrument is now assumed in contingency plans, protecting people looks like protecting access to the instrument. In other words, the standard of care quietly becomes the standard of continuity. Once both sides can summon bursts, adversaries start wargaming the window itself. Targets harden for the exact length of a likely dose, building protocols for the hot zone and the afterglow. That detail reveals how an ostensibly limiting drug can inflate baseline violence. When both sides assume temporary invulnerability exists, everyone escalates to survive the peak. Calm periods shrink, peak periods intensify. Missions that once used time to negotiate now budget time to crush. Planners assume a soup counter might appear, so they stack redundancy. Antin-soup measures alongside Temp V users, drones ready to distract, lawyers primed to mop up. This helps explain the bruised look of the world after Temp V spreads. The ordinary phrase because organizations plan for the exceptional. Equipment improves for peaks while decaying for everything else. Civilian risk rises for a simple reason. Short windows reward speed over care. If the power ends at 4 o'clock, every minute spent verifying a target looks like waste. That incentive structure scales mistakes with power. An ordinary misread merely injures a plan. A misread under Temp V injures a city block. Insurers notice first because they quantify aftermaths long after headlines move on. Actuaries rename events. Where policies once wrote acts of God, they now write acts of supes, and premiums move accordingly. Municipal budgets absorb new lines for reinforced glass, emergency cleanups, and legal settlements wrapped in secrecy. This helps explain public cynicism that rises even without direct harm. Citizens see costs without seeing control. They are told the system is safer while paying for its exceptions. Disasters, which used to summon a sense that the state would switch into higher gear, begin summoning contracts instead. In the wake of a mass casualty incident, public officials call authorized responders, whose kits include Temp V. The state moves, but it moves through a vendor. From the outside that can look like efficiency. In practice, it hands price, power, and data to the supplier, and the public inherits dependence. Procurement mechanics lock the pattern in place. Indefinite delivery contracts and option years make it easy to keep buying from the same certified lanes. Training programs and center of excellence partnerships create sunk costs that discourage switching. What mattered here was the institutional glue. Once reporting systems, compliance forms, and indemnity carve-outs are tailored to a vendor's product, alternatives look irresponsible, even if they are cheaper or safer. Permanent supes respond with their own politics. Some lean into brand work and immunity demands, arguing that enduring heroes remain the only accountable option. Others agitate for exclusive zones, areas where only licensed supes, not Temp V users, can operate, citing safety but defending status. This helps explain sharper public rhetoric from celebrity supes. If temporary power looks close enough to permanent power, reputational risk must push those differences louder. Inside Vought, that tension is useful. By setting standards for professional heroism and administering the training for compliant Temp V users, the company brokers both sides of a rivalry it created. Supes licensed by Vought gain prestige. Agencies licensed by Vought gain permission. That detail reveals a deeper control schema. Define safety, grant exceptions, and monetize the border between them. Ordinary operatives adapt because careers bend toward tools that decide outcomes. Hazard pay and special mission badges begin clustering around Temp V units, which shifts talent and attention toward the window. In practice, that drains patience from non-escalatory skills, language, negotiation, local ties, that only bloom if missions slow down. When budgets tighten, those programs look like frills next to a vial that promises certainty by 4 p.m. Where access is scarce, gray markets fill the gap. Counterfeits, diluted doses, and diverted lots travel in the same channels that used to carry small arms. The black market risk is not only toxicity, it is miscalibration. A city that plans for a 4-hour peak becomes unpredictable if the drug lasts 40 minutes or 14 hours. That uncertainty pushes officials back to the certified vendor, reinforcing the cycle that produced the shortage. Public pressure tries to break the loop by demanding a right to know. Activists discover that they can sometimes move a brand faster than they can move a government. They ask for batch lists, adverse event logs, authorized buyer registries, and facility audits, not because these end harm, but because transparency creates a lever. In a world where corporations have become larger than many states, information becomes the protesters' way to move the center of gravity. Vought responds with staged transparency. It publishes glossy dashboards with safety summaries and compliance achievements, while walling off the clinical truths behind proprietary claims and national security letters. This is regulatory theater with data props. The important point is not whether a PDF exists, but who decides which cells are blacked out. Oversight that cannot compel the unredacted page becomes assurance marketing. Beneath the paperwork runs a quieter transformation that the philosopher's line captures neatly. Man's deed becomes an alien power. The organizations that adopted Temp V to control risk find their rhythms now controlled by the drug's risk profile. Metrics that once measured readiness now measure readiness to dose. What looked like an instrument becomes the environment, and environments are harder to exit than tools are to set down. As this normalizes, trust in permanent institutions bleeds away. People stop believing in ordinary capacities because officials keep promising exceptions. Break glass in case of emergency becomes break glass on Thursday, and that predictability breeds resentment. The paradox is that predictability does not equal reliability. Windows close, shipments slip, a hot zone opens with no one authorized to enter it. The promise of power reveals the fragility of timing. Failure modes become systemic rather than individual. A missed delivery does not just strand one team. It cancels a week of interlocking missions scripted around the window. Brownouts of Temp V ripple like power grid failures, forcing commanders to improvise with half plans and exposed units. The next week, those commanders pad for uncertainty by over-ordering, which tightens supply elsewhere and fuels the very shortages they fear. Information asymmetry sharpens the edge. Vought, with its telemetry from authorized uses and black market seizures, builds predictive models that governments cannot match. It can nudge demand by forecasting threats, price risk into contracts dynamically, and offer resilience packages that bundle supply with consulting. This helps explain why even skeptical agencies end up deeper. Saying no to the package looks like saying yes to blind spots. Internationally, Temp V destabilizes the idea that power could be contained within borders or treaties. States without permanent supes can buy bursts through cutouts, while non-state actors fund labs at a fraction of the cost of raising a superhero class. Arms control language tries to catch up, drafting clauses about batch tracking and authorized use, but enforcement looks like policing code names and invoices, not molecules. The map of power starts to resemble a leasing market more than a roster of standing armies. Escalation continues because every adaptation creates another planning assumption. Security contractors build anti-window services designed to keep facilities survivable through a visiting burst. Police departments add window drills to their calendars and quietly downgrade community programs that cannot show up on a heat map of peak hours. This helps explain why civic life feels more brittle. When institutions tune themselves to resist or deploy peaks, the valleys become unattended space. Insurance spreads the logic into everyday transactions. Real estate deals include supe clauses. Event permits require contingency riders. Small businesses bundle incident deductibles into their prices. Consumers who never see Temp V nonetheless pay for it, and the surcharge reads like a tax levied by a private standard. The line between public risk management and corporate product continuity blurs until audits cannot tell them apart. Meanwhile, the mythwork that sold superheroes has to be revised on the fly. The old story said heroes were rare, chosen, and therefore accountable in a way a crowd could witness. Temp V says anyone can be chosen for a day, which empties the myth while retaining the spectacle. What matters for narrative control is who assigns the day. If the answer is a vendor's calendar, the civic story relocates from town hall to logistics hub. Regulatory theater adapts to the new script by extending pilot phases indefinitely. Temporary authorization becomes a default status renewed each quarter, with progress reports that highlight harms mitigated, not harms caused. Committees propose more training, more data sharing, and more interagency task forces, each proposal landing, by design, in a place Vought already operates. The system looks busy because busyness is the product. At street level, the human math grows sharper. Families of injured bystanders learn to navigate a triage economy of settlements, therapy vouchers, and non-disclosure agreements. Career paths bend around who will and will not sign exposure waivers. Protesters argue in front of glass lobbies instead of capitals, because those are the doors where decisions harden. The swivel of power invites the swivel of dissent. Even so, a counter-logic flickers. Some units quietly invest back into slow skills because they notice that rooms shaped around timing fail when timing fails. A few cities negotiate for disclosure hooks, batch lists tied to public dashboards, indemnity contingent on publishing black box data. These are small moves, but they signal an understanding. The power to borrow force for a day is also the power to borrow accountability and push the bill forward. The bill will not wait forever. As costs aggregate across users, departments, and budgets, the clever compromises begin to wobble. Auditors want numbers Vought will not release. Voters want safety without the surcharge. And inside the company, strategists see a familiar cliff. A product designed to feel temporary that has become structural. The next contest is not about new powers, but about who is allowed to decide when the lights switch on and who pays when they switch off. Shortcuts do not win because they are safe. They win because they make tomorrow someone else's problem. That is the logic that lifted Temp V from contingency plan to operating doctrine. It sold near-term certainty and exported the true bill to bodies, budgets, and the public square. Decision-makers optimized inside narrow windows. Commanders needed a resolved raid, not a resolved decade. Politicians needed proof of action inside a news cycle. Executives needed a product that looked responsible and defensible while it expanded the market. Temp V answered each of those clocks. A bounded 24-hour window felt like a fence that promised control by design, which eased conscience and justified procurement. And what mattered here was not kindness, but calculability. Risk, however, does not accept marketing boundaries. True risk compounds across three multipliers: how often you use the tool, how bad it can go when it fails, and how judgment erodes while you use it. Temp V raised all three multipliers at once, even as it looked like containment. Frequency rose because the window invited repetition. If you can rent power for a day, the next day asks for the same rental. Workflows adapted to expect the upgrade and then to require it. In practice, a temporary tool became a standing assumption. Severity stayed fat-tailed. The worst outcomes were not a little worse. They were orders of magnitude worse. Collateral harm scaled with power, and misreads amplified under adrenaline. Once a plan hinged on a timed miracle, every delay pushed toward catastrophe. Judgment degraded subtly but reliably. The drug narrowed attention and overclocked confidence. Users missed second-order effects, which are the ones that keep operations safe. That detail reveals why small planning errors turned into public crises. The strategic paradox follows. A safer, time-limited alternative to permanent enhancement widened access to catastrophic potential. You did not need a permanent monopoly on power to wreak permanent damage. Aggregate harm went up even as individual cases looked controlled. At scale, the arithmetic was brutal. 1 unit dosing every week meant 50 chances a year for error. Combine that with severity spikes and degraded judgment, and the expected losses grew faster than any single commander could see. This helps explain why institutional costs felt sudden when they were, in fact, baked in. Meanwhile, the incentive map stayed tilted. Near-term certainty generated promotions and headlines. Long-term costs arrived as diffused liabilities, medical write-offs, and public mistrust. The important point is that those costs did not land on the same desks that authorized the doses. Vought understood the map and designed around it. Framing Temp V as controllable responsibility was corporate social responsibility in lab form. It looked like a call box on the wall, reassuring, sometimes useful, and brand safe. But like most call boxes, it was built to serve the building's owner first. Corporate benevolence has hard edges. A corporation can do good only when it helps the corporation do well. Well, that is not cynicism. It is structure. Marketing a time-limited drug as restraint created political cover while growing dependence that was profitable and defensible. Control lived in the clock and the contract. Authorization software, custody chains, indemnity bundles. These were not mere accessories. They were levers. Whoever managed timing and paperwork managed outcomes, which shifted real power from operatives to the supplier who set the rules. This is how technocratic tools move politics without speeches. You do not announce a new regime. You publish a usage guideline, an indemnity rider, a compliance checklist. Outcomes shift because instruments steer behavior more faithfully than slogans. Once institutions adapted, rollback became expensive. Training, scenarios, and budgets wrapped themselves around timed bursts. Different teams lost slow skills and replaced them with call the upgrade muscle memory. Even when leadership froze purchases, Exceptions and workarounds filled the vacuum. The stickiness was not only operational, it was narrative. Agencies had told stories about precision, courage, and clockwork control. Walking those stories back risked legitimacy. In practice, that reputational stake locked in future purchases as much as any contract. Oversight tried to catch up, but the venue mattered. Public relations could not compel data. Regulatory theaters standardized supply routes rather than restraining them. Courts, however, could force discovery, testimony, and records, the only windows that corporations struggle to shutter. Activists have long used long trials to turn secrecy into public evidence. The lesson translates. When a courtroom becomes a forum, internal spreadsheets and risk memos see daylight. That is not a cure-all, but it shifts leverage away from proprietary shields and toward public accounting. And yet even credible trials move slowly against adaptive markets. Every month of delay rewards black markets and refiners. Counterfeiters reduce telltale markers, add masking agents, and sell microdosing kits that promise fewer hemorrhages while quietly extending exposure. The supply does not vanish. It migrates. Governments face a separate paradox. They are imperfect, but at least partially accountable. Corporations are not built for public accountability. The rational play, then, is to reinvigorate democratic oversight while resisting the defeatism that says only markets can decide. Even a flawed hearing that compels data can alter the cost calculus. Expect, therefore, a narrowing legality and a widening clandestine use. Formal carve-outs will survive for elite teams under dense compliance. Everything outside those lanes will slip into deniable channels, international cutouts, and front companies. And public fatigue will dull outrage, which lowers the political price of quiet continuation. Countermeasures will proliferate too. If some actors schedule power, others will schedule disruption. Timing jammers, metabolic blockers, rapid assays, and late-phase deterrents will enter standard kits. Each layer solves a local problem while deepening system complexity and the temptation to just dose and push through. Inside that arms race, procurement logic will continue to favor apparent certainty over slow competence. It is easier to buy a timer than to rebuild a culture. It is faster to brief on an antidote than to retrain judgment. The next step depends on whether leaders can accept near-term vulnerability in exchange for long-term resilience. Some will. We have seen hints already. Disclosure hooks with automatic release, independent injury registries, and budget lines that fund non-supe alternatives first. Those are not glamorous fixes, but they rebalance incentives. They reward units for not dosing, which is where real change starts. Even so, the moral ledger will not reconcile cleanly. The borrowed power transfers pain forward. The interest compounds in trust, in health, and in the normalization of emergency logic. The longer a system leans on exceptions, the more the exception becomes the rule. This is the quiet damage. Not only the body's harmed, but the civic muscle that atrophies when people stop expecting normal rules to work. When a society organizes around always-on emergencies, every choice becomes urgent, and urgent choices rarely make room for restraint. That is how temporary tools become permanent habits. So who controls the clock now? Formally, vendors and authorizing officials. Functionally, whoever can create urgency on demand. Media cycles, political rivals, and volatile threats all move the hand toward dose now. The timer looks mechanical, but the finger on the start button is social. The forecast, then, is not a neat ban or an unfettered boom. It is a contested middle, narrower legality paired with broader evasion. More transparency in court, more opacity in contracting. Stronger countermeasures, but also stronger incentives to escalate early. What breaks that loop is not a bigger speech. It is instrument-level reform. If the tools that set the schedule come with automatic public ledgers, if the indemnities expire without audited data, If budgets default to slow capacity, the shortcut stops being the cheap choice. You change outcomes by changing the math. And that brings us back to the open question we began with. Temp V turned power into a scheduling problem, which moved authority to whoever owned the clock. It worked because it hid true costs inside institutions wired to chase immediate advantage. It fails because those costs compound faster than the wins they purchased. In other words, the shortcut is not an anomaly. It is the predictable result of incentives that privilege now over later and image over structure. The wreckage is not accidental either. It is the bill coming due, with interest charged to health, trust, and stability. Temp V made that loan visible. We know what it buys, and we know what it extracts. The choice ahead is whether to keep borrowing from the same ledger, or to build systems that can say no even when the timer promises a cleaner day. The logic is clear. The question is whether the people inside it can accept the cost of patience.